The candle on the steward's desk had burned down to a thumb's length, and Aldous Vane was counting. 3 breaths to compose his face, 2 to set the pen down without a sound, 1 to lift his eyes to the door he had not yet been ordered to open. He had served 3 dukes in this house, and he had learned that the worst sentences came in the calmest voices, and that the calmest voice in the county belonged to the man now pacing on the other side of that door. The fire in the study was low. The hour was nearly midnight. The decision being made on the other side of the wall would, by morning, belong to half the country, and Aldous already knew which half would laugh first. "I'd rather marry a maid than her," the Duke said, and the words came out flat as a coin laid on a table. The steward did not move. He had heard a great many declarations in this room. He had heard a younger Duke, the present one's father, declare a war over a hedge. He had heard a dying duchess declare forgiveness for a sin no one had named. He had heard the present Duke himself declare, at the age of 9, that he would not be afraid of thunder, and then sit for an hour with his small hand on the back of a wolfhound until the storm passed. He had learned to listen for what was underneath. Underneath this sentence, there was something he had not heard before. Not anger, not even contempt. A kind of exhausted, ironclad refusal that had been polished so long it shone. The Duke walked once the length of the carpet and turned. The carpet had been worn by exactly this pacing, by exactly this man. For exactly the 11 years since his father's death, Aldous could trace the path with his eyes closed. The Duke stopped at the window. The window held nothing but the dark and a faint glaze of his own reflection. "You will write to her father tomorrow," the Duke said. "Be cordial. Be brief. Say the engagement is impossible. Do not give a reason. Reasons are seized and shaken. Give him none." And then, after a pause measured exactly by the falling of a coal in the grate, the Duke added, almost to himself, "I would rather take a girl off the back staircase and set her at the head of my table than spend one more evening listening to that woman tell me what my own house should look like." It was not, Aldous thought, the sort of thing a duke should say aloud. Dukes had thoughts like that. Dukes did not say them where steward or fire or polished window could remember. He inclined his head a quarter inch. "As your grace wishes." The Duke turned then, and for the first time in the conversation, he looked at the steward properly. And Aldous, who had known him since he was a boy with bruised knees and an unreasonable attachment to a wooden horse, saw that the Duke had hurt himself. There was a small flicker, not regret. Acknowledgement. The Duke, who measured his words the way other men measured grain, had let one slip, and he had heard it slip, and he did not call it back. "You think me unkind," he said. "I think your grace is tired," Aldous said. The Duke almost smiled. It was the smile of a man too disciplined to allow more than the corner of it. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "Write the letter." Aldous bowed. The door closed behind him with the small, well-oiled click that had been its sound for 40 years. The corridor beyond was cold. The lamps had been turned low for the night. He walked the length of it with the slow, even step that had become his self, and he did not let himself feel, yet, the dread that had begun to gather in the pit of his stomach the moment the Duke had used the word maid. Because Aldous Vane, who had served 3 dukes and lost a wife and a son in the same winter, who had been chosen for his discretion as much as his ledgers, who could keep a household of 40 staff moving like a well-tuned clock, knew something his master did not know. He had known it for almost a year. He had carried it the way one carries a glass too full, with the careful hands of a man who has already imagined what spilling would mean. He had told no one. He had not been certain enough to tell, and he had been afraid, in a small and private corner of himself of what would happen if he were. The girl who had been hired in March to scrub the upstairs grates and turn the linens in the west wing was not a girl off the back staircase. She was a young woman who had walked into the servants' hall in a plain gray dress and a borrowed name, and a calm so deep it had made the housekeeper uneasy without knowing why. She had asked for the lowest work, and she had done it without complaint, and she had refused with quiet firmness any promotion, any softening of duty, any notice. She rose at 4. She slept in the smallest of the attic rooms. She had, in 9 months, been seen by the Duke exactly twice, both times in passing, neither time properly. He did not know her name. He certainly did not know that the name she gave was not the one her mother had whispered into the side of her head on the morning she had been sent away. Aldous did. Aldous knew because he had been the steward of the neighboring estate 21 years ago, before he had been promoted into this house, and he had carried a fat-cheeked infant across a hall in those long-gone days, and a face, even a grown one, does not entirely forget itself to a man trained to remember every face that passed through a service door. He had recognized her in March in the half-light of the laundry corridor, and she had recognized that he recognized her, and they had stood for one breath in mutual, terrified comprehension, and then she had said, very quietly, "Please, please," she had said, "let me work. Let me stay. Do not tell him." He had not told him. He had not, in 9 months, told anyone. He had told himself, in the silence of his small room, that her reasons were not his business, that a person who hides has earned her hiding, that a steward's first duty is to the running of a house and not to the unmasking of those inside it. He had told himself these things because they were true and because they were also convenient. He had not, until tonight, had to weigh them against anything heavier. Now he carried a candle down the back stairs to write a letter that would refuse, in courteous and ducal language, the hand of one of the most powerful young women in the kingdom, on behalf of a man who had just declared, in a room with one ear in it, that he would rather marry a maid. The dread in Aldous' stomach was a small, hot, exact thing. It had a shape. The shape was the shape of a sentence not yet spoken. He did not know yet who would speak it. He suspected, with a steward's gift for foreseeing how rooms would arrange themselves, that he would. In the kitchen, the fire had been banked for the night. A single low light burned by the dresser. He sat at the long deal table where the staff took their meals and trimmed his nib and uncorked the ink and began, in the careful copperplate that had been his pride for 30 years, to compose the letter that would burn the Duke's name in 3 counties by Wednesday. He wrote, "My lord," with the deepest respect. He paused. He thought of the Duke's face at the window, polished, exhausted, finally heard. He thought of the young woman 3 floors above him asleep on a narrow cot who had not asked to be discussed and who certainly had not asked to be the unwitting subject of a Duke's late-night refusal. He thought of the girl she had been at 4 years old, in a hall 30 miles east of here, in a yellow dress, holding the hem of her mother's gown and watching the doors with the grave attention of a child who has already understood that some doors do not open again. He dipped the pen. He wrote on. He did not yet know how to end the letter. He suspected the letter would, in the end itself. And so the first night of what would become, by Sunday, the most talked of engagement in the county, passed in a silent kitchen with one steward, one candle, and one secret that had been kept long enough to grow teeth. In the morning, the house woke as it always woke. The undermaids went down the back staircase with the soft, padded footfall they had been trained into. The kitchen took on its slow roar. The great rooms above were aired, and the long curtains drawn back to let in a gray, considering light. The Duke rose at 6. He rode for an hour. He returned, took coffee in the small breakfast room overlooking the east lawn, and read his correspondence with the same composed inattention with which he did most things in the early hours, as if he were holding the day at a polite distance to see what it intended. Aldous brought the letter to him at 8:30. The Duke read it once. He set it down. He said, "Good, send it." Aldous did not move. He held a small silver tray at the precise angle that 30 years of service had taught him, and he held in his throat a sentence that he had spent the night not writing. The Duke noticed. The Duke noticed everything. It was one of the inconvenient facts of his nature. "You have something to say," the Duke said. Not a question, an observation, gently set down between them like a teacup. "If your grace will permit," Aldous said. "Permit," the Duke said. "About what your grace said last night," Aldous said. The Duke's face did not change, it rarely did, but the air around him cooled by a degree that only a steward of long acquaintance would feel. "About the maid," the Duke said, with a faint, almost weary amusement. "I assumed you would assume it was a figure of speech." "I did," Aldous said. And then, because the night had been long and the dread in his stomach had grown its small white teeth and would not be ignored, he added, "And then I assumed it was perhaps not." The Duke looked at him. For the first time in years, properly looked. Aldous had been a piece of furniture to him for so long, valued and well kept, that the act of meeting his eyes had something in it of touching a familiar wall and discovering a window. "Sit down," the Duke said. "I would rather stand, your grace." "Sit down, Aldous." Aldous sat. He set the silver tray on his knees, because he did not know what else to do with his hands. The Duke watched him with a patience that was, Aldous understood, more dangerous than impatience would have been. "Speak plainly," the Duke said. "I have not the morning for circling." Aldous took one breath. He measured it, as he had measured the breaths in the corridor the night before. He thought of the young woman in the attic. He thought of the small, exact words she had used in March. "Please." He thought of the letter that would go out by noon and the laughter that would follow it across the county by Wednesday. He thought of the Duke as a boy with a hand on a wolfhound's back, and of the present Duke at the window with his polished, exhausted reflection, and of the sentence he had spoken into a room with one ear in it. "There is a maid in this house," Aldous said, "who is not what she appears to be." The Duke's expression did not move. The fire in the grate cracked once, softly, as if obliging the moment. "Go on," the Duke said. "She came to us in March," Aldous said. "She gave the name Anne Caro. She asked for the lowest work and has done it without fault. She rises at 4. She has never once asked to be noticed. I hired her under that name knowing it was not her own." The Duke's hand, on the rim of the coffee cup, became very still. "Whose?" he said. Aldous looked down at the tray. He looked up again. He gave the name as one gives a coin one has been holding too long, with relief and with regret. He gave the name, and he watched, with the quiet, terrible clarity of a man who has been a witness all his life, the small flicker pass behind the Duke's eyes, and the recognition arrive, and the recognition be folded immediately away into the deep, controlled place where the Duke kept everything he could not yet afford to feel. "She has been here," the Duke said, 9 months. "Yes, your grace. In my house. Yes, your grace, scrubbing my grates, among other duties, your grace." The Duke set the coffee cup down. He did it with such care that the sound of china meeting saucer was no louder than the sound of an eyelid closing. He stood. He walked to the window of the breakfast room, the same long, considered walk he had used in the study at midnight. He stood with his back to Aldous and looked out at the east lawn, where the gardeners were rolling the dew off the grass with long wooden planks, as they had done in his father's time and his grandfather's. He did not speak for a count of, Aldous estimated, 20 seconds. It was the longest silence the Duke had ever held in his presence. When he turned, he said only, "Bring her to me. Now, Your Grace." Now Aldous rose. The silver tray was still in his hands. He set it down with the care of a man laying down a weapon. He bowed. He went out of the breakfast room and down the long corridor and through the green baize door and down the back staircase with the steady, even step of his self, and he did not let himself feel. Yet, the second dread that had begun to gather behind his ribs, which was not the dread of telling, but the dread of having told. She was in the linen press on the second floor, folding sheets. She looked up when he came in. She had a way of looking up that was not a servant's way. It had taken him months to identify what it was, and when he had identified it, he had been more afraid of her, not less. It was the look of someone who had been taught, from the age of 5, to read the room she was entering before she set her foot inside it. He said, "His Grace requires you." She did not move at once. She finished the fold she was on. She set the sheet down on the pile. She smoothed it. Then she looked at him, and the look was not angry. It was not even surprised. It was, he realized, the look of someone who has been waiting for a knock and has heard it. "You told him," she said. "I told him." She nodded once. She put her hands together in front of her, the way she had been taught a long time ago in a hall 30 miles east of here, and she said very evenly, "Thank you, Miss Vane. I have wondered how it would come." "It is come," he said. She walked beside him along the corridor and down the back staircase, and through the green baize door, and along the long corridor, and to the door of the small breakfast room, and she did not falter, and she did not adjust her cap, and she did not, when he opened the door, hesitate on the threshold. She crossed the threshold as if she had crossed it many times before. In a sense, Aldous thought, she had. She had been crossing thresholds her whole life. The skill of crossing them without showing the weight of what one carried across was, he understood, the first art she had ever learned. The Duke was standing by the window still. He did not turn when she came in. He said, without turning, "Leave us, Aldous." Aldous bowed. He went out. He closed the door. He stood in the corridor for 1 breath, 2, 3, with the steward's discipline that had been his pride and his hiding place for 30 years, and then he walked back down the corridor toward the green baize door. And he did not allow himself to wonder, yet what shape the silence inside the breakfast room was taking, only that it was taking one, and that by the end of the morning it would have a name. Inside the small breakfast room, the Duke stood at the window with his back to her for a very long time. She did not fill the silence. She had been taught not to. She stood 3 paces inside the door with her hands folded and her eyes on the carpet, and she counted, as she had counted in worse rooms, the threads in the border of the rug. 12 red, 8 gold, a single irregular cream where the weaver had run short and made do. She had always liked the cream thread. It was the kind of small dishonesty a craftsman commits to finish a thing, and she had a private fondness for small dishonesties committed to finish things. The Duke turned at last. He looked at her the way a man looks at a map he has been told is wrong. Not unkindly. Searchingly, he took her in with the slow, methodical attention he had been raised to use on horses and treaties and the faces of men who wanted favors, and she let herself be looked at, because there was nothing else to do. He said, "You are not Anne Caro. No, Your Grace." He said your name. He said it as one says a word one has not used in a long time and is testing for breakage. It came out, she thought, almost gently. She had not expected gently. "Yes, Your Grace," she said. "You were sent away when you were a child. I was 11, Your Grace." "I remember it," he said. He looked at her with a small surprise, as if he had not expected to. "I remember being told. There was a scandal. There was a great deal of language used in this house about it that I was not, at the time, supposed to hear. I heard it anyway. I was 13. I remember thinking it sounded unjust." She did not answer. There was no answer that would not cost her something. He said, after a moment, "You came here in March." "Yes, Your Grace." "Why?" She looked up at him then, properly, for the first time. She had not meant to. It had cost her not to. All the months she had passed him in the corridors, with her eyes lowered, but the question was asked plainly, and she had been taught, long ago, that plain questions deserved plain answers, and that the courtesy of plainness was the last courtesy the unprotected had to offer. "I came," she said, "because I had nowhere else to go that did not require me to be the person I was born as, and I had decided I would rather not be that person any longer. I knew this house had a large staff. I knew Mr. Vane had been kind to my mother once. I knew you were said to be a fair master. I came in the gray dress and the borrowed name because I wished to disappear into work and not be found. And yet," the Duke said, "you have been found. By you," she said. "Yes, Your Grace." He looked at her a long moment. He said, "You have scrubbed my grates for 9 months, among other duties, Your Grace." He almost laughed. It was the smallest possible laugh, more a movement of the breath than a sound, and it surprised them both. He shook his head once. He sat down at the small breakfast table and gestured, with the slightest movement of his hand, to the chair across from him. She did not move. "Sit," he said. "Your Grace, I would rather not." "Sit." She sat. She sat as one sits on a chair one has dusted that morning. She kept her hands in her lap. She did not look at the table. He said, "Last night I told my steward a thing I should not have said aloud. I said it in temper. I said it in exhaustion. I said it because I have spent the autumn refusing, in 100 polite languages, to marry a woman who would, by the end of the first year, have replaced everything in this house with something more fashionable, and I said it in a sentence that has by now, no doubt, taken on a life of its own among the staff. I said I would rather marry a maid than her. I did not mean it as an instruction. I meant it as a complaint. I understood it as a complaint, Your Grace." He looked at her sharply. "You heard it. The whole servants' hall heard it by breakfast, Your Grace. Walls in this house are thinner than Your Grace supposes. Mr. Vane was the only one who did not repeat it." He closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, he said, "And now my steward has come to me at 8:30 in the morning and told me there is a girl in my house whose name is not Anne Caro and whose father is a man I knew by reputation before I was old enough to shave, and I sit here understanding 2 things at once. The first is that he has told me because he is afraid that what I said last night will be carried by some servant with a long tongue and a short memory to the very ears that should never hear it, and that the consequence to you, who have done nothing but fold my linens and ask to be left alone, will be considerable. The second is that he has told me because he has decided, in his stubborn and incorruptible way, that the time for keeping has ended and the time for choosing has begun. Is that a fair reading? I cannot speak for Mr. Vane, Your Grace. I am not asking you to." She was quiet a moment. Then she said, "It is a fair reading." He nodded. He looked at his hands on the table. They were long, well-made, very still. He said almost to himself, "I am not in the habit of being maneuvered in my own house. No, Your Grace. And yet he said, I find I am not angry to have been. She did not answer. There was, again, no answer. He looked up. He said, You will not go back to the linen press today. Your Grace, you will not, he said more firmly. The thing my steward fears will happen by tomorrow night at the latest. There is no household of this size in which such a sentence does not travel. By the time it reaches the wrong ears, it will have become an order, not a complaint. I would rather it find you already removed from the place where it can be used against you. She said, I have nowhere to be removed to, Your Grace. He looked at her. He said, You will be removed to the small east sitting room, which is presently disused. Mrs. Hale will see that you are given a proper room on the family side. You will not be a guest, exactly. You will not be a servant. You will be, for the present, a person under the protection of this house, while we decide what is to be done. She felt, for the first time in 9 months, the small, terrible warmth of being treated as if she might be a person whose tomorrow was worth deciding. She did not let it reach her face. She had been taught long ago that warmth shown was warmth taken. Your Grace, she said, with the careful evenness she had practiced in worse rooms, this will be observed. I am counting on it being observed, he said. She lifted her eyes. He met them. I have spent 11 years, he said, being courteously cornered by every family in 3 counties who wishes to plant a daughter at the head of my table. I have refused them all in the same language and with the same smile, and every refusal has cost me, in small ways I have learned to absorb, a little more freedom of movement in my own life. Last night I said, in a room I believed contained 1 ear, a sentence that has likely, by now, been heard by 20. By Wednesday it will be a story told at every dinner in the county. By Friday it will be a joke. By Sunday it will be a scandal, unless something is done with it that takes the joke out of its mouth. She understood then what he was saying. She understood it before he had finished saying it. She had been raised, after all, to read rooms before she set her foot in them. She said, very quietly, Your Grace cannot. I can, he said. The question is whether I should. She looked at him a long moment. She said, You do not know me. I know enough, he said, to know that you came into this house under a false name and have not, in 9 months, lifted a finger against anyone in it. I know you were sent away as a child for a thing that was not your doing. I know your father's house, and I know what it cost you to leave it. I know you fold sheets like a person who has been taught that a fold is an act of respect. I know you crossed my threshold this morning without faltering. There are men I have known for 20 years of whom I know less. She did not answer at once. She said, Finally, Your Grace, if you do this thing to spite a woman, you will regret it. I do not propose to do it to spite her, he said. I propose to do it because I have, this morning, discovered that a sentence I spoke in temper has accidentally described a possibility I had not considered, and I am too old and too tired to refuse a possibility on the grounds that I arrived at it inelegantly. She almost smiled. She did not. She said, Your Grace, I have not consented. No, he said. You have not. I am not asking you to consent today. I am asking you to allow Mrs. Hale to put you in a proper room and to allow me to call on you, with Mr. Vane present this afternoon, and to speak to you as a man speaks to a woman whose answer he is waiting for, and not as a master to a maid. If at the end of that conversation you say no, I will write to your father this evening, and I will see you placed in a household where you will be safe and where the name on your papers will be whichever name you choose, and you will not see me again unless you wish to. If you say yes, The letter to the lady will go out tonight. The engagement to you will be announced on Sunday at the chapel. And the joke will, with the help of God and a steward of considerable competence, be taken out of the county's mouth before it can swallow." She sat very still. She said, "Why Sunday?" "Because," he said, "the lady and her father are expected here on Monday. They must find me already engaged, or they will not find me at all. I would rather they found me engaged." She looked at her hands. She thought of the cream thread in the carpet. She thought of the morning she had been sent away, and of the woman who had whispered her name into the side of her head, and of the small, exact words she had used in March. "Please." She thought of the steward at the deal table at midnight, with one candle and a letter that did not know how to end. She understood, with the calm clarity of a person who has been reading rooms all her life, that the letter had ended itself after all, only not in ink. She said, "I will speak with your grace this afternoon." He inclined his head. It was, she noticed, the same quarter-inch of inclination that the steward had used in the study at midnight. They had been in this house, all of them, a long time. They had learned the same small courtesies. There was a kind of comfort in it. He said, "Thank you." She rose. She went to the door. At the door she turned and said, "Your Grace, one thing. Yes, if we speak this afternoon and you change your mind, I will not hold it against you. I have not been held by anything for a long time, and I have learned not to mind the absence of holding. Do not be afraid of disappointing me." He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "I will try not to be afraid of it. I cannot promise." She went out. In the corridor, Mrs. Hale was already waiting, summoned by the bell that the Duke must have rung the instant the door began to close. Mrs. Hale was a woman of 50, with a face like a closed door and a heart that the under-housemaids would have wept over had they ever been let near it. She looked at the girl who had been Anne Carrow and was no longer, and she did not betray, by so much as a flicker, what she had heard the housemaids whispering at breakfast about a sentence spoken in the study at midnight. She said only, "This way, miss." The word was a small bell rung in the corridor. It went on ringing in the girl's ears all the way up the great staircase, the staircase she had not, until this morning, been permitted to climb, and into the east sitting room, where a fire had already been lit and a tea tray was already being brought, and out of which, by the afternoon, a different person would step. In the meantime, the house had begun, in its quiet and meticulous way, to do what houses of that size do when something has shifted at the top. Doors opened a little more softly. Voices in the kitchen lowered. The housekeeper sent the most loose-tongued of the kitchen maids on a long errand to the home farm, with instructions that would keep her gone until evening. The under-butler, who had been polishing the same spoon for 10 minutes while listening through the serving hatch, was reassigned, briskly and without explanation, to the cellars. Aldous Vane walked the corridors with his usual even step and his usual unreadable face, and he saw, in the small adjustments of every person he passed, that the house had already understood, in the wordless way houses do, that the morning had become a different morning, and that whatever was to be said next would be said in the careful, lowered voice that great houses reserve for the moments in which their future is being decided. He went, at last, to the chapel. The chapel was a small stone room off the east wing, used now only for the household's Sunday observance and for the occasional christening. It was cold. It smelled of beeswax and old linen. The pews had been worn smooth by the knees of 4 generations of servants and 3 of family. He sat in the back pew, where no one would think to look for him, and he put his hands on his knees and bowed his head, not in prayer exactly, but in the steward's nearest equivalent, which was an accounting. He had told. He had carried a thing for 9 months, and at the moment when carrying became collusion, he had set it down. He had set it down in front of the only person who had the power to do something with it that was not cruel. He had done it knowing that the Duke might, in his exhaustion and his temper and his peculiar honor, do precisely the thing he had said in jest, and that if he did, the steward's hand would be in it. He sat with that knowledge. He measured it. He did not yet know whether it weighed more or less than the knowledge of having kept silent and let the joke run loose. He thought of the girl as she had stood in the linen press, with her hands folded and the sheet half folded behind her, and that look on her face that was not surprise. I have wondered how it would come. He thought of the Duke at the window with his polished, exhausted reflection. He thought of his own wife, dead now 11 winters, who had once told him, in the early years of their marriage, that the only sin a steward could commit was to imagine that not acting was the same as not choosing. She had been right. She had usually been right. He had not, until this morning, understood quite how right. He rose. He left the chapel. He went back to his small office off the servants' hall, and he sat at his desk, and he opened the great household ledger, and he began, in his careful copperplate, to make the small, dry, practical entries that the day would require. A room to be aired, a dress to be ordered discreetly from the town, a notice to be drafted, in case it was wanted, for the chapel on Sunday, a letter to be held, not sent. He worked steadily. He did not let himself think, yet, of what he would write in the ledger on Monday morning, when the lady and her father arrived to find the engagement already announced and the joke already taken out of the county's mouth. He suspected the entry would be brief. The most consequential entries in that ledger had always been the briefest. At 3 o'clock he was sent for. He went up to the east sitting room. The Duke was there, standing by the fire, and the young woman who had been Anne Carrow was seated in the chair by the window, in a plain blue dress that Mrs. Hale had produced from somewhere, and the tea things were on a small table between them, and the conversation, by the look of both their faces, had already been going on for some time, and had reached the kind of quiet that comes when two people have said the difficult things, and are now sitting in the small, unfamiliar weather of having said them. "Aldous," the Duke said. Without turning, "Sit." Aldous sat. He sat in a small chair near the door, the chair of a witness, which was the chair he had occupied, in one form or another, his whole life. The Duke said, "The lady and I have spoken. She has consented to be married to me on Sunday, at the chapel here, by Reverend Atwell, with you and Mrs. Hale as the witnesses. She has consented on certain conditions, which I have accepted. The conditions are these: that her name, the name she was born with, will be used in the entry and in the announcement, and that no attempt will be made to soften or disguise the history attached to it. That the staff who served alongside her in these 9 months will not be dismissed, reassigned, or shamed for having done so. That you, Mr. Vane, will not be punished in any visible or invisible way for having kept her secret, nor for having told it. That she will be permitted after a year, if she wishes, to leave this house and this marriage with the protection of a settlement already drawn, and that this provision will be put in writing today, and witnessed by you, and held by you, and not spoken of again unless she speaks of it." He paused. He looked at Aldous. He said, "You will find these conditions, I think, in keeping with your own sense of the matter." Aldous bowed his head. "Yes, Your Grace." The Duke said, "The letter to the lady will go out tonight, in your hand, in the language you proposed last night, with one alteration, which is that you will add a single sentence informing her of my engagement, so that she may not be ambushed by the news at the chapel door on Monday. The cruelty of surprise is, I have decided this morning, not a cruelty I am willing to author, even toward a person who has caused me considerable, inconvenience. Yes, Your Grace, the Duke said. On Sunday, after the service, you will read from the porch of the chapel the announcement of the engagement. You will read it in the voice you use for the rent days. You will not embellish. You will not apologize. You will read it as a fact already established. The county will do with it what the county does. By the time the joke reaches them, the joke will have a wife in it, and a wife is harder to laugh at than a sentence. Yes, Your Grace. The Duke said, Is there anything you wish to add? Aldous looked at the young woman in the chair by the window. She looked back at him. There was, in her face, none of the triumph that a lesser person might have permitted herself, and none of the fear that a smaller person might not have been able to hide. There was only the calm, considering look of a person who has, after a very long time, been seen, and who has decided, after careful thought, to allow the seeing to stand. Aldous said, Only that I am very sorry, miss, for the manner in which it has come to you. She said, You are not to be sorry, miss, Vane. You did the thing I would have asked you to do, if I had had the courage to ask. You spared me the asking. That is a kindness, even when it does not look like one. He bowed his head. The Duke said, Then it is settled. Aldous, write the letter Mrs. Hale will see to the rest of the house. I will, with the lady's permission, take a walk in the East Garden, where, I am told, the gardeners have been particularly assiduous this autumn, and where the hedges, by all accounts, are obliging. She almost smiled. She did not, quite. She inclined her head a quarter inch. It was, Aldous noticed, the same inclination. They had been, all of them, in this house a long time. They had learned the same small courtesies. There was a kind of comfort in it. The remaining days passed in the quiet, methodical way that houses of that size manage even the largest of changes. The letter went out by the evening post. The lady in the next county received it the following afternoon and tore it once across, and then folded it and put it in her writing desk, where she would, 10 years later, find it and read it again and discover, with the surprise of older people who have been spared what they were not spared at the time, that she was glad. Her father, when told, raised his voice in his study for half an hour, and then went out to the stables and stood with his hand on a horse's neck until the horse, which knew him very well, turned its head and breathed once against his sleeve, and the steam of its breath in the cold air seemed to him, for reasons he could not have named, a sufficient answer. They did not come to the house on Monday. They sent, instead, a brief and very correct note of congratulation, which Mrs. Hale framed in her own small parlor and looked at occasionally with private satisfaction for the rest of her life. On Sunday morning, the chapel was full. The whole household had crowded in, and a few of the tenants from the home farm, and the Reverend Atwell, who had baptized the Duke and buried his father, and had not, in 40 years of service, ever once felt that his small stone chapel had been quite at the center of anything, found that it was. That morning, at the center of something, and read the service in a voice that surprised him with its steadiness. The girl who had been Anne Caro stood at the altar in a plain ivory dress that Mrs. Hale had had altered overnight from one of the late duchesses, and she said the words in a voice low and clear, and the Duke said them in the same voice, and the two voices, Aldous thought, sounded as if they had been made for the same room, which, in a sense, they now were. After the service, Aldous stood on the porch of the chapel in the pale autumn sun and read the announcement in the voice he used for the rent days. He did not embellish. He did not apologize. He read it as a fact already established. The tenants nodded gravely, the way tenants nod at facts already established. The household, behind him, stood very straight in their Sunday clothes. The county, by Tuesday, had the news, and by Wednesday had begun, in its astonished way, to revise the sentence that had been running loose in its mouth for a week, and by Friday had decided, with the swiftness with which counties decide such things, that the Duke had not, after all, said anything of the kind, and that the girl had been, all along, a long-lost cousin of suitable rank, and that the whole arrangement had been a matter of family duty quietly managed. The joke went out of the county's mouth. It did not return. In the weeks that followed, the house settled into its new shape. The young Duchess kept Mrs. Hale, and Mrs. Hale, who had served 3 duchesses and had loved none of them, found herself, to her private astonishment, beginning to love this one. The under housemaids who had worked beside her in the linen press were, by her quiet instruction, neither promoted nor demoted. They were given small, exact courtesies that did more for them than promotion would have done. The kitchen maid who had been sent on the long errand to the home farm was given a small raise, which she did not know was for the silence she had not, in the event, been required to keep. The under-butler was returned, in due course, from the cellars, having learned, in his weeks below stairs, a useful lesson about spoons and serving hatches. The Reverend Atwell preached, the following Sunday, on the text of seeing, and seeing rightly, and being seen, and did not, the household agreed, embarrass anyone by overdoing it. The lady in the next county married, within the year, a viscount with a great deal of money and a great many opinions about wallpaper, and was, by all accounts, exactly as happy as she had a talent for being, which was happier than she would have been in the Duke's house, and she lived a long and ferociously decorated life. Her father, in his last years, surprised everyone by becoming an unexpectedly mild old man with a fondness for grandchildren and for sitting in the sun. The Reverend was made, by the Duke's quiet recommendation, a canon of the cathedral, and accepted the appointment with the modest pleasure of a man who had not, until that moment, known he had been wishing for it. Aldous Vane continued as steward for another 11 years, at which point he retired, with a small house on the estate and a pension that was, by the standard of stewards, embarrassing, and spent his evenings reading in a chair by the fire, and was visited every Sunday afternoon by the young Duchess and her 2 children, and was, on the day he died, sitting up in bed with a cup of tea and a letter from her in his hand, and was, by all who knew him, much missed. As for the Duke and his Duchess, they lived. They lived in the house, and they walked in the east garden, where the hedges, as predicted, were obliging, and they sat by the fire in the long evenings, and they spoke less than other married people, and understood more. And the year that she had been permitted to leave came and went without either of them mentioning it, and the writing that Aldous held in the locked drawer of his small office was never asked for, and was, after his retirement, quietly burned by him with her permission on a clear, cold morning in the grate of the breakfast room where the whole thing had, in a sense, begun. They had 3 children. They had a great many small, intimate evenings. They had, in the end, the kind of life that does not make for stories in the county, which is the highest compliment a county can pay. And the sentence that had been spoken in the study at midnight, the sentence that had threatened, for a few days in autumn, to become a joke, and then a scandal, and then a wound, was forgotten by everyone, in time, except by the steward who had heard it, and by the man who had spoken it, and by the woman who had been, accidentally, and then not accidentally at all, its answer. The 3 of them remembered it. They did not speak of it. They did not need to. It had become, by then, the small, dry, private joke of a house that had learned, between Monday and Sunday of one quiet week, how to take a sentence out of its own mouth and put a life in its place. And now, if you have stayed with me by the fire this long, draw your chair a little closer for a moment. If you have ever spoken, in temper or in tiredness, a sentence you wished at once to call back, and watched it walk out of the room ahead of you and refused to be called. If you have ever been the quiet person at the edge of a great house, scrubbing a grate or folding a sheet, and wondered whether the life you were born to would ever find its way back to you in a shape you could bear. If you have ever kept a secret for someone for a long time and known, on a winter morning, that the keeping had become a kind of harm, and set the secret down in front of the only person who could be trusted with it, and waited to see what they would do. If you have ever been seen, properly seen, after a long time of moving through rooms with your eyes lowered, and felt the small, terrible warmth of it, and not let it reach your face, then this story has, in some quiet way, been about you. Tell me, will you, which line stayed with you? Was it the sentence at midnight, or the word please in the laundry corridor, or the cream thread in the carpet, or the announcement read in the rent day voice on the porch of the chapel? Sit with it a little. Some lines are meant to be sat with. And if you would like to come back to this fire another evening and hear another life unfolded slowly in this same low voice, you are welcome here. This hearth is kept lit for listeners like you, and there is always another story warming on the hob, waiting for the next quiet hour we can share. Until then, sleep well and walk gently through your week, and keep, if you can, one small kindness in your pocket for the next person who crosses your threshold without faltering. Good night, friend. Good night.